I changed the prelude. It just continued to not fit after a week of practice. So I decided to do, Joplin was not too influenced by the Southwest, but he did write one piece called Solace, which is subtitled A Mexican Serenade. It doesn't sound like, I think, south of the border music most of us associate with, but it's the only reference he ever made to the Southwest. And it's a very sweet piece, so I'm going to play the Joplin Solace this morning.
Good morning. I welcome you here to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. I'm the Reverend Monica Dobbins. I'm the assistant minister of this congregation, and especially if you are visiting today, you are our honored guest. I invite you after worship to stop right out here at the first table you meet, our congregational life table. We'd love to meet you, get to know you, and let you get to know us a little bit as well. Sometimes our worship services are uplifting and full of joy and hope, and then there are services like today's worship, where my hands bring sadness and suffering to you, trusting that here we have created a space where sadness and suffering can be examined tenderly and compassionately, and where we can hold one another as we examine it together. About a month ago, I traveled to the U.S.-Mexico border as a part of an interfaith delegation of clergy, laypersons, and activists. Well, all of us were activists, really, to hike into the Sonoran Desert in the height of summer and leave life-saving water for migrants passing through. Today, I'm sharing part of that story with you. It won't be easy to hear, and truly it won't be easy to tell either. But in the most difficult stories that we have, that's where we find our calling, our shared ministry together. The flaming chalice is our symbol of determination to bring light even to the world's darkest corners. We light it now. Light in the darkness, we gather around you. We are listening for the voice of the world's deep need, and we commit to respond with our own deep yearning for justice. Now I invite you to rise in body or in spirit, and let us sing together number 127. When we need a story that reminds us of our responsibility to those around us who are suffering, we often think of the story of the Good Samaritan. And that's a good one of the best stories there is. But one story isn't always enough to sustain us. And so when our delegation needed inspiration to go into the desert and leave water for travelers, a much older story from the Hebrew scripture came to mind. Hear these words from Exodus 17. The whole Israelite community set out into the desert, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Let us enter into a spirit of prayer or meditation. Spirit of life, whose name is mercy, make us mindful that there are migrants who are walking through the desert along our southern border right now, at this moment, wondering why God has brought them out of Egypt to this thirsty and desolate place. Take our open hearts to the place where they are walking. Put our feet into their shoes. Give us a glimpse of their journey. Let us, each and every one, feel the staff in our own right hand. Let us see the rock standing before us. Give us the strength to strike it and make the water flow. Give us the vision and the courage to do what is necessary, not only to relieve their suffering, but to move the waters of our own lands, so that no one need ever suffer in this way ever again. May it be so. Amen. This is an account from the Reverend Daniel Grudy, who is a minister and a professor at the University of Notre Dame. During midsummer, while traveling in the southern part of Arizona, about 30 miles north of the Mexican border, I passed a man on the side of the road. He was waving empty water jugs in his hands and obviously in need of help. I did not stop, but kept on driving. As I traveled down the road, I could not stop thinking about his situation. All at once, the complicated laws at work on the border began to rush in on me. I realized I was not only at the border between Mexico and the United States, but at the border between national security and human insecurity, sovereign rights and human rights, civil law and natural law, citizenship and discipleship. For one long mile, 3 images went through my head. The first was the parable of the Good Samaritan. The second was the Last Judgment. And the third was that of an elderly priest, a good friend and a mentor, who spent many years working with immigrants. Once, in a very similar situation, we drove by someone and he said, "I never take chances with somebody like that." Surprised by his words, I said, "What do you mean?" He replied, "That's Jesus over there, and we need to welcome him." These 3 stories made me turn the car around to go help this person. In its own story of migration, Israel was delivered not only from a specific geographical place, but also from a narrow way of thinking. Liberation at Sinai was not simply about taking off the shackles. It meant taking on a new mindset and ultimately learning to love as God loves. The migration of Israel was meant to help them re-envision how to live in the world. But it was easier to take Israel out of Egypt than it was to take Egypt out of Israel. After coming to power and prosperity, Israel frequently forgot its history and subsequently mistreated those who came to it as strangers and immigrants. We need a new kind of movement, a cognitive migration. One of the most difficult parts of immigration is not the physical journey, but the feeling that you are no one to nobody. As difficult as the physical struggles are, many immigrants say that the most difficult part of the journey is the indignities they face. When talking with one immigrant in a detention center, he said, "I've walked across deserts in the scorching heat. I've slept in the mountains in the freezing cold. I've stowed away in buses and trains and known what it is like to go without food or water for days on end. But what is worst is when people treat you like a dog, like you are the lowest form of life on earth. Nothing hurts more than feeling like you are not even worthy to be a human being." Ministry to the migrant begins with recognizing that the greatest hunger of the migrant is not only for food, but to be valued as a human being. My friends, you're doing good work today. Let's take a break. Take a breath. Maybe stretch out a little. Turn to your neighbor and say, "Neighbor, I got you." Turn to your other neighbor. "Neighbor, I got you." We're going to have some announcements, which are important to the life of our congregation. We're going to say hello to each other, and we're going to pass the baskets around, and then we're going to dive back in. Are you ready? All right. First of all, I want to say that it's the beginning of the church year, and some of us forgot who we are over the summer, and some of us forgot who each other are. So I encourage you, if you've gotten out of the habit of wearing your name tag, to put it on every Sunday. You know, next week is in gathering. All the little kids going to be back here, and they want to know who you are. So put on your name tags, and if you don't have one, or if you left it in the car, you don't know where it is, you can just stop by the welcome table and get on the list, and they'll make you a beautiful new one, just like that. Second thing, and this is also about names. Stephanie, our administrative assistant, is compiling a new directory. Woo! But a new directory is worth nothing if it's got your address from 20 years ago. So check in if you've moved in the last couple of years, if you have a new phone number, if you're getting email at your work address, whatever it is, check with Stephanie. Just go ahead and do it. Make sure she's got your latest information so the directory will be up to date. Third thing, our sanctuary effort is so inspiring, and I think it has a lot to do with what we're talking about today, with respecting human rights, with being in solidarity with migrants. And so we need lots of volunteers. Now, sometimes you hear, "Oh, they've got 200 volunteers." Well, guess how many people are really doing most of the work, right? So if it's been a while since you volunteered, if you haven't volunteered and you'd like to give it a try, you've got a little time, right? Go on and sign up for a shift. We can take care of you out in Elliott Hall today. Last thing, September is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. This is something that's really close to my heart and to many of you as well. Now, Governor Herbert asked that we all make today a day of prayer for suicide prevention, but I forgot to get my agenda into him, and so he didn't know that I was already preaching about migration. I don't know if he cares, but in any case, I already had today planned out. So what I'd like to encourage you to do is to join me on September 15th at 9 o'clock, Liberty Park. We're going to walk in a big citywide walk for suicide prevention. It's a Saturday morning. You know you don't have anything to do on Saturday morning, right? If you'll see Adrian Splinter right outside here in Elliott Hall right after service, she's going to show you how to sign up and just what to do. And then I'll be there with you. We'll walk together. We'll hold each other up. And now, we're going to do the thing. We're going to say hello to one another. We're going to pass the baskets around and welcome each other here to First Unitarian Church. It started with a spot of green light on the rock next to my left boot. It looked like light shining through the bottom of a Coke bottle or through a sun catcher in a window. I stared at it, then I squinted at it. It couldn't possibly be real. I looked up over my shoulder to see where it was coming from. Of course, there was nothing there but a spindly mesquite bush from which I was leaning away so I wouldn't get stuck by a thorn. and the empty desert sky. I looked back down, and there it was again. I looked away, turning my gaze to another rock, and there it was. Oh, this was no reflection. I looked at a friend's trail pack. There it was. My right arm. There it was again. This was something in my own vision that was causing me to see something that wasn't there. Our group had taken a break for shade and water, and we were all crouched beneath a stand of bushes that did little to mitigate the searing heat of the Arizona desert. We all drank from our portable bottles, though much less deeply than we had 2 hours prior, at the start of this hike down into the Growler Valley. I think we were all beginning to run out. And as we all stood there together, helping each other to our feet and pressed on up the Charlie Bell Road to where the trucks were waiting to take us back to town, I only had to walk a few more yards before I tipped my bottle up and tapped the last remaining drops of water into my mouth. I was out of water and not out of trail. A few more yards, and I realized I had stopped sweating. A few more, and my feet slowed. I stopped. I sat down, and I called for help. We had gone into the desert to deposit jugs of fresh water for migrants passing by on their way into the United States. It was my second time visiting that desert. The first time I went was in 2014, when I joined a group of UU ministers and seminarians on a journey to learn about the pressures facing migrants from Central and South America as they attempt to enter the United States and cross into one of the deadliest landscapes on the planet. This time, I had come to serve. So we rose before dawn on Sunday morning. We gathered together in the town square and ate breakfast and packed our lunches. Then we circled round on the town lawn to pray and sing and hold hands and ask blessings on our journey. Then we rolled out with the desert sun rising in beauty and in threat. My group hiked down into the valley about 2 miles and left water at the Charlie Bell Well, where the Fish and Wildlife Service maintains a water source, not for humans, but for cattle and wild animals. Then we hiked back, a total of less than 4 miles. And in less than 4 miles, I was already showing signs of heat exhaustion. But the migrants I had left this water for had already hiked as much as 60 miles and still had another 20 or 30 to go. People who come often from the jungles or forested highlands of Central America who couldn't have even imagined this heat, this aridity. People like Saul Salazar, a father of 2, who had been living and working in Phoenix for years, who had been picked up and deported and was found dead the morning before our hike to the desert, having tried to cross back to his wife and kids, and just ran out of water. That's why I'm telling you about how I ran out of water while trying to leave water for others, not because I want to be praised or admired, far from it. It's because unless you've been there, unless you've felt in your own body the panic of being in one of the hottest deserts on the planet and running out of water, unless you've felt the panic of what would it be like if the group noticed I was slowing down and decided to leave me behind, unless you've been there, you can't really understand what the millions of Mexican, Central American, and South American migrants living in our country have been through. You can't understand the strength of their determination to find peace, to live in safety, to have enough, to be reunited, unless you've been separated, been lost, ran out. poet Warsan Shira says that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And Central America has been a school of sharks since the 1980s, when the United States used the perceived threat of communism to defend their interference in government reforms that would have given valuable farmland to indigenous people, taking it away from American companies with interests there. Furthermore, the war on drugs, started by the United States, pushed drug cartels from Colombia into Central America, making Central America and southern Mexico some of the deadliest places in the world to live. Naturally, people went north. People from Central America have always come north to work, to hang out, or to visit family. Time was you could just walk across and no one minded. But as violence in Central America escalated, the stream of people migrating north became a flood. And rather than visit and go home, they had to stay. It triggered an old, reliable mechanism in the American social apparatus, a racist anti-immigrant panic that has appeared cyclically in every generation, affecting the Irish, Eastern Europeans, Chinese, South Asian, Japanese, Somalis, Arabs, nearly every minority ethnic group you can imagine. Only 5 years after the wall fell in Berlin, we began to erect our own fence along the southern border in 3 strategic areas, with operations Hold the Line in Texas, Safeguard in Arizona, and Gatekeeper in California. Fences went up first in the cities, El Paso, Nogales, San Diego, using scrap metal from the Gulf War. The government didn't bother putting fences in the desert between the cities. The assumption was that the deserts were naturally so forbidding, so terrifying, that no one in their right mind would attempt to cross through them. This wasn't just a matter of common sense. This was official policy. Set out in a 1994 Border Patrol memo, the policy was called Prevention Through Deterrence. Measures of success included, no kidding, increase in complaints against the Border Patrol, fee increases by smugglers, more document fraud, and more violence at attempted entries. Those are measures of success. And they were right. As the danger of crossing the border increased, as more and more people had to try to enter by walking through the desert, migrants could no longer trust their friends to guide them into the U.S. Gangs and mafias took over the human smuggling business, jacking up the prices into the thousands of dollars, meaning that once migrants arrived here in the U.S., they could no longer think about going home someday. Now, once they were here, with their life savings gone, they really had no choice but to stay and start saving up to pay for their families to come here too. So many of them don't make it. Saul Salazar is just one of hundreds of people who have been found dead already this year, and so many more are never even found. It's impossible to know how many, because the official numbers that the Border Patrol reports are only the ones they find themselves. They won't report the ones found by humanitarian groups, by other law enforcement agencies, by hunters or hikers. If the border police doesn't find the body, then they are nobody. And how do we report the ones who are simply taken by the desert and never returned? They are not called missing by the families. They are called desaparecido, disappeared. There are 2 main things that I want you to know that I've learned by getting involved in this. First, there is not just one border crisis. There are many border crises all tangled up in each other, and that means there are no easy solutions. We've all heard about the children separated from their families in Texas. PBS reported last week that over 500 families still still have not been reunited with their parents, and some of them, it is certain, will never be. The ongoing trauma from these separations will haunt these families, and you can be sure our nation, for the rest of their lives. It is also true that smugglers sometimes bring women and children across the border, instructing them to claim that the smuggler himself is the father or husband. They claim that this will protect the women and children, even though the smugglers often sexually assault their charges. And the children aren't the same as the hundreds of unaccompanied minors who try to cross the border alone every year, usually young teenagers who aren't old enough to stand trial in adult court. There's the crisis of people being processed 75 at a time in U.S. criminal court under Operation Streamline. Their belongings taken from them and deported in busloads to the Mexican border, sometimes still wearing their jail clothes, which makes them sitting ducks to gangs and mafias on the border. What little money they may have had confiscated at their arrest has been returned to them as a useless check drawn on a U.S. bank they can no longer access. There's the crisis of fruit and other produce rotting by the ton in U.S. fields for lack of migrant workers who have picked it for generations, while NAFTA trade regulations make the exact same products unaffordable for them to buy in their hometowns. There's the crisis of law-abiding, tax-paying people being picked up for a broken taillight or an expired tag and being deported without their families ever knowing what happened to them. There's a growing crisis of U.S. citizens from border regions being refused passport renewals on suspicion of falsified birth certificates. And the list goes on and on. There is not one border crisis. There are as many border crises as there are people crossing the border, and the border is now everywhere. In his new book, The Line Becomes a River, author Francisco Cantu shares his experience of being a Border Patrol officer, yet another human crisis on the border, as human beings work in government jobs that repeatedly ask them to set aside their humanity in the service of law and order. He quotes historian Timothy Snyder, whose work has told the stories of the genocide of Eastern Europeans between the world wars. Snyder urges his readers not merely to remember the 14 million people who died of starvation and political murder during that time. He goes a step further and asks us to remember them as 14 million times one. Snyder says, to join in a large number after death is to be dissolved into a stream of anonymity, to be enlisted posthumously into competing national memories, bolstered by the numbers of which your life has become a part, is to sacrifice individuality. He gives the reader this charge. It is for us as humanists to turn these numbers back into people. That, to me, is the best and highest meaning of the term humanism, to make it our moral and spiritual goal to be human and to humanize other humans. And this leads to the second thing that I want you to know. We who are American citizens can do something to end the border crises. Even though the problem is enormous and complex, there are practical things we can do to affect this situation and to end it. Each strand of the tangled web will have to be pulled in a particular way, but there are things we can do that will make a difference no matter which strand we're pulling. First, as Snyder says, it is our task to turn the numbers back into people. So we need to see each migrant, each immigrant, each deportee as an individual person, as a member of our community, as a human sibling and a fellow citizen of the world. This is exceedingly difficult to do in our society because not only have people with money and privilege taken great pains to segregate themselves away from poverty and suffering, but also because people who are undocumented often prefer to draw little attention to themselves and prefer to live and work in places where they will be understood linguistically and culturally. So we must do what we can to desegregate our communities. We must get to know our neighbors. Even when language and geography present barriers, the barriers aren't insurmountable, and often they're illusory. And we must humanize, starting with the way that we talk about migrants, immigrants, undocumented folks, asylum seekers, reminding our friends and neighbors that no human is ever illegal. Furthermore, we should know our own migration stories, where our people came from, and what they went through to get here, and relate these stories to our own experience. They're not always that different. We all come from somewhere. And second, we must use the leverage that we have to move society. Of course, each of us individually can affect the quality of the places where we work, live, and shop, advocating for people in those places who do not yet have the privilege of American citizenship. We can leave water for migrants, yes. The people who are doing it in the borderlands right now are ordinary people like you and me, Samaritans, who give a thirsty traveler a drink of water, the most ancient form of hospitality that there is. We can also provide help right here where we are with documents, legal assistance, help getting medical attention, and access to schools and housing, and many other things that citizens never have to think about. But churches also have a role to play in resisting the anti-immigration policies of the state. I believe that when we are doing the work of changing the world, we need heroes to look up to, people who've been in trials like our own, who have summoned the courage to be true to their convictions, even in the face of enormous difficulty. The hero who inspires me to resist the evil spirit of the times is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German pastor and theologian whose unshakable commitment to God gave him the strength to face the Third Reich, even up to his execution in a concentration camp. Bonhoeffer wrote voluminously on the role of the church in the times of extremis. He knew that the church could never be subsumed into the service of the state and still be faithful to God. He said that it is the church's role to help the state balance its responsibility to providing law and order with humanity's responsibility to God. If the state is not creating an atmosphere of law and order, then it is the job of the church to draw the state's attention to this failing. And if, on the other hand, the state is creating an atmosphere of excessive law and order, it is the church's job to draw attention to that too. But if the state continues to perpetrate evil, then at some point the church must directly take action. The church's responsibility at that point, Bonhoeffer said, is not just to bandage the victims under the wheel, but to put a spoke in the wheel itself. What does that mean? To put a spoke in the wheel of state injustice. It means that we acknowledge that just because something is legal does not mean it is moral. And it means that we affirm that we answer to a higher law. We affirm our own humanity and the humanity of others as the highest law to which one person can answer. We remember that slavery was legal. We remember that Jim Crow was legal. We remember that Japanese internment was not only legal, but a program sanctioned by the state. And we can say never again. Never again will we stand by while human beings are put into cages. Never again will we be silent while children are torn from their parents. Never again will we pretend that we don't know that people are dying out here in these deserts trying to make their way home. We will hear them. We will take up our staff and we will strike the rock and make the water flow. We can do nothing less. Amen. More peace. More joy. You may be seated. I didn't want to give you a travelogue today. I wanted to share how I felt in the desert and how I feel about this issue and what I want you to feel and what I want you to know. However, if you want details, I'm going to be in Little Chapel at about 11:15. And just do a quick Q&A if you want to know more of the what we did on the trip or more details about anything that I talked about. I'll share what I know with you, and I'd love to hear from you as well. These words were shared with us, written by Pastor Allison Harrington, who is now the minister at Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, where the sanctuary movement got started back in the 1980s. These are Beatitudes. Blessed are you who journey with child on back or in arms, leaving behind war for the hope of peace, for you shall find sanctuary. Blessed are you who wait, patient and impatient, at the armored doors of our nation, for you shall find welcome. Blessed are you who sit in detention centers, for you shall find freedom. Blessed are you with ankle monitors, for you shall run free. Blessed are you who are deported, for you shall return once again. Blessed are you whose children are stolen away, snatched from your very breast, for they shall run back to you, leaping into your arms. Blessed are you who cross the desert. Blessed are you who make it. Blessed are you who don't, for you shall live forever. Blessed are you who protest, who march, who sit in, who go to jail, for righteousness shall be yours. Blessed are you who will stop at nothing until each and every child is found and placed back in the care of their families. And blessed are the children, orphaned, lost, afraid, calling out in the night. Blessed are you, for you shall inherit earth and stars and moon and sun. Blessed are you, for you shall know once again the embrace of your Father's sacred arms and the kiss of your mother's sacred lips. Blessed. David, the music today, it was wonderful, very evocative, and took me right back there. Thank you all for coming out on this holiday weekend to church. Hope you got your spirit fed, and now we'll get some coffee, have some caffeine for our brains, and once again, 11:15, I'll be in Little Chapel to answer questions if you like.